Welcome everybody to the CTSI Distinguished Seminar series. And today we have a very distinguished speaker and very unique for the metabolism theme. It's not the same type of speakers that we always have, a person that runs a lab and report on experiments. Today we have a very unique speaker, and this is Anthony Michaels, and he's a national leader in the biological agriculture system approach to sustainable farming, and one of the pioneers of sustainable food production. Before I add to his titles, I'll tell you why I find it so fascinating to have Anthony speaking here, because Anthony connected the chemistry of farming and the decision that the farmer is taking, and how is that influencing the nutritional value of our food, and how this food is going to influence our health. And this is something we don't think about. We just talk about the content of the diet. We say that's much fat, that's much sucrose, or what the caloric intake, but we don't think about how do we actually get it to the table. So when the person is saying, I'm going to get 2 tomatoes, what does 2 tomatoes mean? And that it can mean very different things based on how they were grown and what the farmer decided to do. And understanding this can make a huge change in our recommendations to changing the diet. And that's why I think that it really opened my mind when I heard Anthony speaking in a forum that we had for the past year, a weekly forum. And I understood that we are missing one step. We always talk about how much fatty acid this person is consuming, whether those are saturated and unsaturated, but this person is not consuming saturated or unsaturated. This person is consuming a chicken or a tomato, and they don't know what's the content of it. And it's not our decision, it's the decision of a farmer, and the farmer is responding to some economical thing, and the economical is responding to some political thing. So we really need to know that if we want to be influencing. So that's why Anthony is going to make an impact here. And so who is Dr. Michaels? And he's the managing director of Proteus and Environmental Technologies. It is the technology development company in the industry, in the food industry and the farming, and then the Avia Farm Management, which is a company that set up organic farms. He was previously the chief executive officer of Midwestern Bioagriculture, BioAg, a leader in balanced soils for fertility and sustainable agriculture, and chief scientist at Proteus Capital Advisors. Before entering the business life in 2008, Dr. Michaels worked at the Bermuda Biological Station for research, and the University of Southern California, where he studied global nutrient and carbon cycling. In 1996, he became the first director of the USC Wegley Institute for Environmental Studies. The Wegley Institute is an interdisciplinary home for environmental scholarship across the USC, and works to make that research relevant, usable, and understandable to decision makers in society, business, and government. Dr. Michaels has been chair of the Council of Environmental Deans and Directors, which is a network of 160 universities, the Catalina Island Conservatory, and the NSF Advisory Committee on Environmental Research and Environment, and Global Institute on Sustainability at Arizona State University. Dr. Michaels was educated at the University of California, San Diego, the University of Arizona, where he did his first and second degrees, and the University of California, Santa Cruz. And in the past 30 years, he has over 100 peer-reviewed papers and has broad experience in sustainable agriculture, food security, aquaculture, bioenergy, zero waste, and energy efficiency. And this is just a third of what I have, but I think I'll let him speak because this is going to be fascinating. Thank you for coming here.
Thank you. And will this magically come up? Pardon? Oh.
Yeah. Share screen.
Okay, and
This one? Sure.
all right. Is that on? You hear me with? I hope if some people can't hear me online, they can. I talk loud. I'm not loud enough to hear wires. And so, well, thank you very much for coming today and for joining the online. It's interesting to be back in an academic context making talks after spending much of the last couple of decades talking mostly to people that have money to give or have money to want money and farmers. And it's a very different farming structure, as you can imagine, when you're looking at the investor raising money for investing, changing practices. And so I have tried to and I know most of you are not farmers, and so I've tried to take a pretty high level look at this, which is not natural for me because I'm kind of a storyteller. I pulled up some data, but I think the real thing is that I want to make a couple of points. Yeah. Pardon? This way. Unmute me. Ah, okay, okay. All right.
Let's see.
Unmute? Ah, that sounds better. Okay. So I don't know if they heard the previous bit, but what I was going to do is keep this at a pretty high level and sort of focus in on the points that have come up repeatedly in this forum that Ori and I are on every week for much of the last actually it's close to 2 years now, and to try and look at, does it matter what a farmer does when you think about the food that people are consuming through a prism of the nutrition in that food and the metabolic consequences of what they eat? And the answer is yes. So we're done. Any questions? No. Well, I have to say a little bit more than that. I'm not a person of few words, and you'll figure that out. So I'll start with just a little high-level overview of agriculture that'll be unlike, you haven't seen a lot of agriculture talks, so it's very unlike any agriculture talk that you might have seen before. But just sort of what's the prism through which those of us that live in this biological farming world see these things. And based on that, what are the tools that farmers can use to influence the nutritional content of the crops that they produce? And the question is, can we change the nutritional quality of food by the things that farmers do? And the answer is yes. And just to give a little bit of homage where homage is due, this is Gary Zimmer. Gary Zimmer is my uncle. And my uncle was always crazy Uncle Gary, because he, and this is probably going online, so Gary, I'm sorry if you're listening in, but Gary had these ideas for where agriculture could and should go, how to change it from a chemical dominated paradigm to a biological dominated paradigm, and how to do that in a way that made farmers more money. Because if you can make a farmer more money doing a new thing, they'll do the new thing over and over again. And it's the easiest way to make systemic change happen in agriculture. And he developed this biological farming context, wrote books, speaks all over the world on this kind of thing. But he also happened to be my uncle. And when I was in the private equity side, trying to look at where the avenues are for affecting great change in our lives through an investing paradigm, I kept coming back and back to this company, to the point where I finally got a group of people together and we invested in this company. I ended up moving to Wisconsin and becoming CEO of a farming business. But much of the perspective behind this is my filter on the work that Gary has done for much of his life and this company for the last 40 years. But I will start with our family farm. And so, this is the Langer farm, my mom's side of the family. And this is a classic 160 acre, 40 cow Wisconsin dairy farm. Absolutely beautiful little farm. And this is I lived in this farm a bit when I was a kid. This is, all of my relatives came through growing up on this farm. And this, I think, gives a prism into what farming used to be. And so this farm for, well over a century when it was in our family was basically 40 cows in that barn out in the pasture during the day, making about 50,000 to 100,000 gallons of milk a year. You had a bunch of other animals, 50 chickens, 4 to 5 steers or hogs or things like that, because they had 14 kids, which is free labor for, the generational time span of the oldest one to the youngest one going to college. And so you just had to produce a lot of your own food because you were feeding all these kids and it was cheaper than going to the supermarket. And then of that 160 acres, about half of it was to feed the cows. And so that's growing the alfalfa and the corn and the other things that it takes to feed those cows. They do spend time on the pasture, but mostly they're getting the bulk of their nutrition by feeds, because you can influence what they eat and what the nutrition they have to make milk by knowing what their diet's going to be. But the key thing is that 40 cows, almost 100% of the manure went back on the farm, right? Just right there, right around that barn, right in the middle. And so you'd feed these cows much of the biomass from your farm. It would go through, and only 50 to 100,000 gallons a year of water, which is what milk is mostly water, would leave the farm, and the rest of it would go right back onto those fields. So very small removal rate on the dairy side. And then because you still need to have some cash, they would take a modest number of their acres every year and they would grow crops. And there was a cannery nearby, so they grew sweet corn, peas, beans, edible, green beans kind of thing to go to the cannery. And all those kids also spent their time working at the cannery as part of that life. And that was also a net removal, but these are fairly low yield produce. And so you have small yield and a pretty circular economy. So what's happened since then? For a variety of reasons, which if we had a political lens for this talk, I would have a whole different talk about this. Our landscape has shifted dramatically. You go into the Midwest, corn and soybeans, corn and soybeans, corn and soybeans. It's supposed to be half and half. It's usually 2/3 corn and 1/3 soybeans, except these years where soybeans make so much money. But fence row to fence row, almost nothing in between. This is, I pick beautiful spots to take pictures of. Most of Iowa and Illinois and everything else, there's not even those trees. It's just an uninterrupted landscape of grains. And the cows are much more efficient if you don't have to do them 40 at a time and rely on 14 kids going through a series of age stages to do them. You can have a professional modern operation. It's actually not that different for the cow. Cows are herding animals. They kind of are just as happy in this as they are in the little 40-acre kind of a thing. But you really concentrate economically the activity of the cow. And what you do is you bring the crops from fields across the country a substantial distance to big piles right outside of where these cows are. And then you feed the cows, you make the milk, you deliver the milk. And the waste from the cow is now like a sewage treatment plant. It's concentrated waste. It's got to go somewhere. It's put into large pits because, in places with a cold winter, you can't spread it on a frozen field. So there's only certain times of the year you can put it out. So we completely broke up that intimate connection between the fertility coming onto the field and the fertility leaving the field. And my grandfather's farm was mining the farm. He was not replacing everything he took off, but he was taking off so little that it was a harder thing to see. Now we are taking off a lot. And so when you look at this, and these are now different farms for each of these things. They're never on the same farm anymore. Your dairy farms, the modular size of a barn is about 3,000 cows. And those 3,000 cows are making 10 million gallons of milk, dramatically different yield, highly efficient to put it into the milk and cheese and yogurt and the things that are how we consume that milk. But the 10 to 1,000 to 10,000 acres of corn and alfalfa, the feed for the cow, is now completely removed from those fields. And especially because of silage and alfalfa, you're removing all the biomass and you're putting none of it back. So the level at which we've been mining these soils is dramatic. And then the vegetables are now in separate dedicated farms that are also of fairly substantial size. Yields are up, and you have a lot of fertility removal. So the net effect is we're mining these soils. And over time, soils get less and less nutritious. We'll get to how this influences what people eat, but this is the basic fundamental issue with farming, is that we have a net removal. Nobody, if they were oceanographers and they knew mass balance, they would never have done this. But they don't. They're looking at this through a fairly simplified prism for how the fertility works. And the other big thing we've done is we've just gotten really good at growing a few crops. So this is corn, which is kind of the archetypical one. And you can see along the bottom in yellow, all those years of just, it's even steady decline kind of thing, as that little bit of removal is slowly making soils weaker. And that's just the normal open pollinated, take your corn seed from last year and plant it again. And then we figured out how to cross hybrids. First a double cross in blue, and then the single cross, which is the modern method in red. And all of a sudden we had genetic approaches to dramatically improve the yield of crops. And we did. And this is in the face of fewer nutrients in the soil and exacerbating fewer nutrients in the soil. And then the green at the top is when we figured out that we could then genetically modify these things so that we tied the chemistry of the crop protection, the pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides to the genetics of the crop. So you can make more money selling the same chemicals tied to the seeds. All the chemical companies are seed companies. And we continued that sort of 2 bushel per acre per year increase in yield, and it continues up to the present. And so you have this dramatic increase in the removal rate at the same time as we separated the return function for getting nutrients back. And here's a similar thing for wheat. This is the Rothamsted study. This is the longest time series of continuous agriculture for wheat. It's in England. And along the bottom there is what happens if you just plant wheat after wheat, year after year after year, wheat, with no fertility at all. And it's a very low yield, but it's just, rocks do dissolve. Rain carries some nutrients in. You get a little bit back, and you can get a little bit of wheat over time. You bump that up a little bit, and you have some fertility kinds of things that are sort of the program. You see the points where they added agricultural practices, fallowing some years to let the soil recover, adding lime to get your pH back to a nutrient-friendly level. And then the modern herbicides, modern cultivars, fungicides, and then more complex rotations were all done as separate trials in this experiment. And you can see it's a 10-fold increase in the amount of wheat that you can take off. Much of that since the 1980s. And this is a trend that you see over and over again, but you don't see this for zillions of crops, because the expense of doing this and the focus of doing this meant we focused in on fewer and fewer crops to use most of our land, right? Corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa are the dominant uses of land in the United States and in much of the world. And if you look then, and this is a series of things that are based on how long it was from when a field was first broken out of a natural habitat and turned into agriculture, field coming out of prairie is just rich with nutrients. And then you start mining it out. And the main point of this is this cation exchange, organic carbon, soil pH, and yield, is that if you don't do things, you steadily mine the soils out. And this over and over again around the world, as we introduce more and more levels of agriculture without returning nutrients, we mine those soils out. And we also make the soils weak so they don't hold together, so they blow away, they wash away. And this is a report that just came out this year, 57 trillion metric tons of soil lost in the United States because of how we manage the farms. And they actually show pictures of prairies next to farms where you can see a 2 to 3 foot difference in the elevation of the land because the agricultural soil has been losing a soil over that whole time. So this isn't good. So how do you fix it? Well, part of it is you got to manage these things better. The biggest part is, whose job is it to return the nutrients you took off? It's your job as a farmer. And that mindset we have to get back into agriculture. But beyond that, soil is not just minerals. It's a living system. And somehow we have to go beyond just adding back the stuff we took out in its elemental form and rebuilding a soil as a functional ecosystem that serves our needs in the process. And Midwestern BioAg, that was this company Gary founded that I ran for a number of years. We had a few million acres that we were doing. We did a third of all the organic farms in the country. The motto was better farming through better soils. But the converse is also true, better soils through better farming. You can do this both ways. You can build a soil while you farm. You just have to do it consciously. So when you think about farming, you can think about it simply. Farmers got 3 jobs. Get the soil ready, get the plants off to a good start, and make sure that they live up to their full potential. When you plant corn, your field has 600 bushel per acre potential. If every one of those corn kernels produced a new cob of corn with the number of kernels on it that you would expect, 600 bushel. And every day from that planting, it loses potential. And for most farms, by the time it's harvested 100 days later, it's down to a couple hundred, 150 to 200 bushels. We've lost 2/3 of the potential of that crop. Never let your crop have a bad day. You have to have that kind of a mindset. But if you want to not have it have a bad day, you got to get rid of some of the insults and challenges that it has. So when you manage a farm, we talk about a small number of things that I'll cover in a second. But the reason we talk about those is because those are the things that people sell to farmers. I was in the business of selling a different version of those things to farmers, but ultimately our business was teach a farmer how to farm a better way and then sell them the products that allowed them to execute on that. You could go ask John Deere, you could go ask Syngenta and Bayer and all the big chemical agriculture seed companies, and they'd say the same thing. It's their job to teach a farmer how to farm and how to use products and how to then to sell those farmers on those products. But when you think about what a farmer really manages, it's a lot more stuff. You got the physical things, the soil structure, air, water, sunlight, weather. You've got, oops, I'm losing the top, macronutrients, secondary nutrients, cation exchange and organic matter, things that influence nutrients. You have what your cash crop is and the biotechnology and genetics and stuff that influence what that cash crop is. And then other crops like cover crops, things that are not for generating revenue for your business. You have the living parts of this system and the formerly living parts of this system. And so fungi, bacteria, vertebrate, archaea, protists, detritus, pollinators, there's all these living components that you also have to manage. You have the living components that you don't want, the things that are the pests, the weeds, the things that eat your crop, the diseases that they're caused, the fungi that are there. You have the physical manifestations of this, the tractors and things like that you drive across the field, they lay the crops down, the fertilizer down, tend the crop, harvest the crop. And then above all, farming is a lifestyle, but it's also a business. And the second it's not a business, you go out of business, and then you go into town and you get a different job. And farming is a hard business, in part because it's hard, because nature's a cruel mistress in some ways, but it's also hard because it's such a risky marginal business, and yet your whole livelihood depends on it, and your whole identity. As you know, we had to sell my grandparents' farm. It was the saddest day in 3 generations of that family to sell this legacy farm, right? So this is a personal lifestyle connection that it's hard to underestimate in terms of what it does to people's choices. But all the things you do about labor and capital and cash flow and markets and debt. But when you think about all those things are not ever in isolation. They are all tied to each other. This is a classic complex adaptive system. And it's a complex adaptive system that's very under-prescribed, under-described, very, very hard to model and manage that way. But it does have one characteristic, which is the saving grace, is that there are a whole variety of stable emergent property points in this thing, where a system, you can push the system in a certain way, and it goes to a place where all these things then interact with each other in a fairly stable way. And whether it's a biological stable system or a chemical stable system or a sterile kind of a system, there are these stable modes of action that you can shift from. But we don't know shit about this. And I can use that word because usually I would say manure, but we don't know much at all about the true dynamics of this. It's one of the weakest things as somebody that came out of an academic context is what's the mode of action? What's the actual thing that's going on that makes this happen? We don't know. We know what does happen. And if it's repeatable, we know that we can then teach farmers how to get that repeatable outcome. Now, some of this that we do talk about is a result of the Green Revolution. That slope and yield. The Green Revolution is because we learned some things about how to make farming better. The big one was adding nutrients. The second big one was adding crop protection, disease control, weed, pest, and fungus controls. We made cash crops tied to the chemistry by the biotechnology, the Roundup Ready, adding the Bt genes, the bacteria in there because there's certain natural pest control things that are from bacteria. Those genes were then inserted into crops. And this little milieu, this is the economics of farming. These are the things that everybody wants to sell farmers because we can all make money selling a farmer of these kinds of products at really good margins. But it's just that net set, and it's a chemical revolution. Most of these things, by one way or the other, result in death on the soil. Okay, we're killing stuff constantly as our prescription in hopes that we leave our crop alive as the one thing to take advantage of the system we prepared for it. The revolution that's going on now is a data revolution. And some of this is tied back to the chemistries, but a lot of this is also tied to the reality that there's so much good stuff we can do with data that we can look at all these pieces of equipment, all these things that we do, and we can start flowing that information together. The banker wants to know because every farmer's got an operating line that they borrowed from the bank, and the bank wants to know, how are you doing? Are you going to be able to grow enough crop to pay me back? All these, when I'm an organic farmer, all of our big farms are organic. I like this because I got an inspector that's going to come anytime they want, but at least once a year, that's going to ask for a complete data download so I can document every single thing I did. Farmers are not good at taking pieces of paper and writing stuff down. Let the tractor do it. Let the pieces of equipment do it. Dump all that data together and then use it. Use it to manage your farm better. But the revolution that I'm most excited about is the biological revolution that's going on. We are starting to recognize this truly as a complex biological system. All of these different things that all interact with each other are now amenable to manipulation and management. And some of these things are still completely under-described and under-proscribed by academia and by the farmers, but a lot more of this is coming under control. We can make this a living system, stop killing everything, and start promoting the growth of everything. The other big thing, and Orion alluded to this, is that when you ask a farmer to grow something for you, you're going to get what you pay for. If you pay me to do something and it's more than I would get paid to grow something else, I'll grow it for you and I'll take your money and I'll get paid. And so what do we pay farmers for right now? We pay them for weight. I get paid for weight, bushels, tons. So what's the cheapest weight that I can add is water. What's the second cheapest weight that I can add is carbohydrates. It shouldn't be a surprise that all of our nutrition in every crop has been going down because I get paid for weight. And so I'm giving you as much weight as I can for as little price as I possibly can. And this is the fundamental reward system that has to change. And this will come up over and over again. Protein is expensive for the farmer and for the plant. If I'm going to be paid to grow protein, I got to get more money for that than if I can sell you carbohydrate for the same price. Complex biochemistries, a lot of the weird things that we talk about that have these clever modes of action for health, antioxidants, vitamins and previtamins and all that stuff, those are insanely expensive for plants to make compared to carbohydrates. How do we encourage people to pay a farmer for those kinds of things? Well, it's got to be worth something. You got to prove why it's worth something for somebody to be healthier. And then you got to talk a food company into paying me to grow those things. So can we change the nutritional content? Well, I'll tell you where we do get paid for nutrition. It's when we feed it to an animal. So let's go back to that dairy farm, right? When I feed a cow, I get paid by the milk. So when I grow a crop to feed that cow, I get paid for the crop if it makes more milk. And that's nutrition. Right now, and right now, I'll come back to that. And so I get paid for any nutrition that improves the gain or the yield, the milk production. I get paid for any nutrient that replaces a supplement that I've got to add to the diet because it's not in the crop anymore. Okay, so there's two ways that I can get paid for nutrition. And that's the thing I think that's the key insight into what direction this can go. Protein and minerals are the two things that I have the most experience with in this, and agriculture has the most experience with, because they're easy. I mean, it's easy to figure out how to bump the protein content of a crop. It's easy to figure out how to add more minerals to the crop. And those other things we don't know yet as much. But I'll say some things later about why we think it's probably just as easy, if a little bit more challenging to understand. So here's how you feed a cow. And basically, there's a list of ingredients, feed items that you have. The middle column is the bioag example, how we feed a cow. And the far right is or left, right, whichever it is on your screen, is the conventional example, how a normal farmer anywhere feeds a cow. And we modified this. This is a whole software, it's a whole world for how to do this. We modified these so that actually the ingredients are identical. But what you do as a farmer is you go and you send samples of your hay and your alfalfa and your corn silage and your corn, everything else, off to an analytical lab that goes and measures all the nutritional components that are relevant to your farming decision, sends them back. You put those all into a computer. You decide, I want 75 pounds of milk a day. It can get more sophisticated because we're now paid for components. And so if you want more protein or more fat or something like that, whether it's going into cheese or butter, you can do some prescriptions. But these are identical outcomes from the diet perspective. And then we build a diet for this cow. And they're out there on the pasture, they're eating, we're organic, so we get a third of their organic matter intake comes from pastures. But all the cows, you want to try and estimate what that is. So this is all cows that would be in confinement, this is 100% of their diet. And what you can see is a couple of things. This is where their protein comes from. The protein comes from alfalfa and from haylage, which is basically alfalfa that instead of letting it dry and turning it into a bale, you just cut it and put it in a bag, and you let bacteria ferment it, and you create basically an acidic microenvironment that pickles it. Basically, it lasts a long time as haylage, and it's a little bit more nutrient. Now we like that. It's a forage off the ground. It's a lot of protein, so we feed a lot more. 58 pounds of that and 5 pounds of fresh alfalfa. A regular farmer doesn't, because it's expensive to buy alfalfa. So they say, what can we do that's cheaper than that? So they put less alfalfa and haylage in there. Now we put a little extra soybeans in, just as we like soybeans, but they have to put in extra protein. So they put in 17 pounds per cow per day of distillers grains. Distillers grains are what's left over at an ethanol refinery after you make ethanol for our fuel tanks out of corn. It's the protein part of the corn. There's not much protein in corn, but you burn off all those carbohydrates to make ethanol, and you got this stuff left. It's crappy protein, but it's cheap, unbelievably cheap, to the point then where they got to add another 5 pounds per cow per day of protein supplements. All the amino acids that the cow is missing, all of the other stuff that it would take to get the cow to survive on that low quality of a protein. But they save a few bucks. From an energy perspective, almost all your energy is coming from corn. Okay, and in both cases, corn is just really good energy dense products. That's why it's good to add weight to all of our bodies as well. And we do corn silage, where you have all the stalks and stuff. Cows, ruminants, they need all that fiber, but that's harvested in a way where about 40% by weight is actual corn and 60% is the fiber. And then high moisture cell corn, which is the actual grain that you put in. And so we put about 45 pounds of those combined. They put in 66 pounds combined. Okay, so they're much more heavy on the energy side. But these are cows that are coming out the same diet. And so what we have to factor in is that the haylage and the alfalfa also have some energy content in them. There is energy in the alfalfa that's added. We added a lot more alfalfa, so we get more energy from that component, but it's a smaller component of the total. So the last thing, though, is this mineral mix on the bottom. And this is all the stuff that you got to add to the diet, because it's not in any of this feed, and it's never going to be in the corn. And so it's not in the alfalfa anymore. And this was what Gary saw, because this process here is automated now, but it was the same thing farmers have been doing since World War II. He says, why do these minerals? Why is a cow without that mineral mix, pound a day of minerals, is going to die? is not going to produce very much milk. What happened to alfalfa that it's no longer nutritious enough to keep a cow alive? They should live on this stuff. It should be incredibly nutritious. This is what's in a mineral mix. This is just one of our organic ones, but they're all kind of basically some variation on this. Calcium and phosphorus are the two big minerals that are just no longer in the crops the way they used to be. And so you got to add those. And of course, this is a cow making milk. There's a lot of calcium that needs to go into that milk. It's a big draw on the cow. So you got to make sure enough is in there. There's some salt, there's some magnesium, there's a bunch of micronutrients, and micronutrients are through line through all of this kind of thinking, is that nobody ever thinks about them, and yet they are critically important at incredibly low levels for almost all physiology. And then there's some vitamins and things like that, and depending on where you are, the details of this will change. So Gary's great innovation was, what if I throw all that stuff on the soil? Can I get it back into the alfalfa? Can I get the nutrients back? And so, rather than expensive calcium, you can go out there and use cheap calcium, gypsum or something like that, and spread it out all over your field and see if you can bump the nutrient content. And sure enough, you can bump the nutrient content. If it couldn't, I wouldn't be talking about any of this. And so if you look at this, these are some of those constituents on in the diet. The leaf meal is a special one that I've been making, which is a very high protein. We'll come back to this, a very high protein alfalfa, where you take the best alfalfa and then you separate the leaves and the stems because all the protein's in the leaves. So I can make a 35% protein alfalfa, highly digestible. But you look at the average field from our kind of farm, which is the mineralized field one, and then Dairyland is a big company that just makes these measurements for farmers, and they publish the average of all the samples that they get in a year. And so this is the average of all farms in that same part of the country. And what you see is that, between 20 and 50% increases, a little bit less for magnesium, in all of these things happen on a farm where you put those minerals on the farm. That increase is enough to get rid of your need for most of the minerals. But the yield almost doubles of the alfalfa. The crop needed this too. It's not good for the crop to be short on all these minerals. And so when you add it in, I used to say a dairy farmer gets paid twice, once for the additional minerals and a second time for the additional feed, milk that you get for every ton of food. And so this combination is good for the crop. Every farmer gets paid that way, but it also makes for dramatic improvements in the nutritional quality of the feed components. So what about us? We're not cows. What about the things that we eat? This is a lot harder. Nobody asked this question. And so, you can look in the literature and you can get clues on whether or not we could change the nutritional quality. Some stuff is starting to happen now, right? Who's paying extra for this? Milk used to be just grade A, B, C, and you got a straight price per gallon. Guess how much water we wanted to make sure had in, They figured that out, that farmers were, I remember going down to the milk tank when I was living at my grandparents' farm and just slurping a little bit of that cream right off the top of the milk tank and taking it back up for breakfast. Nothing like cream fresh out of the cow, but that's cream that the milk company didn't get. And so now they price it by components. You get paid extra if you have more fat, you get paid extra for more protein, more solids, those kinds of things. And so farmers now raise different kinds of cows. They feed cows different kinds of stuff to push these components into the market so they get a bigger check. So that's actually happening. The other place where people pay today is for health claims of various sorts. And the main one that we looked at was beta-glucan. And if you go into the grocery store, you'll see boxes like this, and Cheerios is just the most notable one. But that big heart-shaped bowl is because beta-glucan, it's about 4% by weight of a box of Cheerios, is something for which there's a legitimate medical claim about its heart healthiness, and they're all over this. So they will then pay, or now they will, they after working with us on this, pay extra for crops that have more beta-glucan. But the first thing they asked us is, can you increase the amount of beta-glucan in oats? I don't know. Never thought about beta-glucan as a thing that we would need. So we went out and we basically just did a real rough study. We took 47 farms in 6 different states that were all states they were already buying oats from, and we knew what the average was that they were producing. And then we planted oats our way, where we're saying we're going to plant oats like we'd plant them if we were going to feed them to a cow. give those plants all the nutritional components that it took to make a really healthy plant. And if you look at it, beta-glucan, the average is 4%. Our average was 6.3%. Some of them were as high as 8%. We could 50% to doubling of the amount of beta-glucan just by being on a better soil. I didn't even do this on purpose. There's nothing about the farming that I did to raise beta-glucan. This is a farm that I was doing to make a better farm for feeding cows with other crops than oats, or for just having a really great soil. And it dramatically improves the beta-glucan. It includes the fat. Fat's a mixed bag, because if fat goes above 9% in a grain, it can go rancid and it spoils your grain. So it's a storage issue. So sometimes having more is not necessarily better. And the protein content went up about 30 to 50% at the same time. Again, soil that's legume dominated in its rotation has all the micronutrients that it takes to do complex nitrogen metabolism in the bacteria and in the crop, gets you more protein in the final crop. There are other crops that we talk about that I still don't get paid for, but where people are starting to make these claims. And so carrots are probably the most obvious one. And carrots are kind of easy because a lot of the things that are nutritionals are the things that make them color. And so you can see there's a tie between the color of the carrot and the amount of nutrition. And so, we can go in and look at these things and you can see, are there differences across varieties? Yes, there are. So if you want to have more phenolics, you're going to plant black carrots. If you want to have more beta-carotene, you're going to go for the darker orange carrots in this process. Okay, so there's a trick. Well, the easiest thing for the farmer to do is just plant a different variety. Now, if it yields less, they want to get paid more, right? They want the dollars per acre to be the same. But there's a lot of this that's really simple. Different varieties have different amounts. Plant the one that's got more of what you want. But the second is, what happens if you fertilize it different? And this is a study that was done on carrots, basically just modifying two things, calcium and boron. And I picked up on this because calcium and boron are two of the most underappreciated nutrients for how any crop grows. And so this manipulated those to look at, and there's, in the paper, there's a whole zillion, every one of the things that you care about that are nutritional additions to a crop. And you can see sort of a factor of 4, maybe, variability by the fertility for just calcium and boron. The crazy thing is, less calcium and less boron gave you more of the nutritional. The calcium and boron about transport, they regulate transport within plants. The stuff's getting stuck in the carrot rather than getting pumped up into the leaves. And that's, again, it's not always intuitive exactly what it is that's going to be the mode of action for something like this. But if you go back and you look, across varieties, you're looking at factor 20 difference in nutrition by varietal pick. Here you can get sort of another factor of 2 to factor of 4. So if I was going to do carrots, I spend more time on varieties and getting the yield up on varieties that had more stuff that you want, and less time on just changing my soil to do that. With tomatoes, though, it's a little bit more balanced. Lycopene, ascorbic acid, things that we like about tomatoes for their healthfulness. This then is by variety, a whole bunch of different varieties on the x-axis. And what you see is, maybe as much as a factor of 2, but variety-wise, it's not that big of a difference between varieties in terms of the amount of these nutritionals. And if you look at fertility kinds of things, it's about a factor of 2 based on the fertility. Now, there's more work on varieties and less on fertility. So if I had to bet, I think I could beat this. I'm sure that farming method was nowhere near as good as I could make it. Boast a little bit. But the reality is, this is a crop that's probably about half how you farm it and about half what variety you pick. Okay, so that gives you a different set of choices in terms of the relative weight of those tools. So the conclusion is that the amount of nutrition in the crop is a function of the variety choices which farmers make and you pay for, and fertility choices which farmers make and need to be paid for. But it is sort of in that 2 to 20-fold range. So it's a non-trivial thing. If you could have something you want people to eat and they could get all the nutrition by eating 5% of the amount you're recommending, that's a different game in terms of how much of disruption of their own livelihood has to go on. But you got to remember who pays for this. So what about the bigger picture of the planet? Because farming itself, there used to be prairies, there used to be rainforests, there were all kinds of pieces of landscape that we turned into farms. And farms produce about 15% of the greenhouse gases. There's a lot of pollution, runoff, dead zones. On average, there's about 14 pounds per person per year of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides put on crops. Our dose, personal dose, is 14 pounds per year of these kinds of poisons that are meant to function in the ounces per acre level of effectiveness, okay? And so I don't know, I worry about stuff like that. That's why we do organic farms. How do you solve these problems? Well, part of the solution is we got to get the yields up. And the yield can't just be weight, right? You can get water in your diet a lot of different ways. It has to be more nutrition per acre or more nutrition per gallon of water in this system. And so there is still a need to drive yield. It's just we got to care about the right things. And you know, if you look at it, one way to look at this is how much land does it take to make 100 grams of protein? 100 grams of protein, not very much, right? If you're doing lamb or beef, you know, it's a couple hundred square meters to make 100 grams of protein with a cow or with a sheep. It's in the tens of square meters for most of the dairy kinds of things, and then smaller and smaller numbers depending on the crops. But you can look at this the other way around, is what crops make the most protein per acre? If you were going to make protein, and this is just the easy example, but any of these things, right now, soybeans make the most protein per acre in the FAO database, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the big global database, okay? So that's a good resource. That's the dominant resource. Rice and corn are next, even though they're energy crops, they're grasses, right, grains. Then legumes, and this is sort of a catchphrase for legumes, but this is peas and beans and all of those kinds of lentils, things like that. And then you got wheat coming in. And again, these are carbohydrate-dominated crops that just make so much yield that there's a fair amount of protein per acre. And then milk and eggs and meat and beef sort of make very, very little protein per acre on average. So 2 of these are legumes. Only 2 of these things are plants that actually make the reactive nitrogen that then goes into those proteins. 3 of those are things that require something else to make that nitrogen, whether it's free-living nitrogen fixation, whether it's nitrogen from some other crop in the rotation, or most of the time, synthetic fertilizer, which gets dumped on the farm that was made through the Haber-Bosch process. And then 4 of these things are things that eat the other ones, right? So you know, it's a false thing to say you're making protein there. You're taking protein from somewhere else and just laundering it through a cow. And so that's. But the trick with this is, you know, this is where your dairy roots come back. They're skipping a crop. This is alfalfa. And I don't know, you've probably heard about the problem with growing alfalfa in California is it uses so much water per acre. It's a water-loving crop. But no one's thinking about how much protein that extra water is making. And this is the amount of protein per acre that a modest alfalfa, the lower bar is the modest alfalfa crop on average kind of fertility. And the big bar is a good alfalfa crop on irrigated land where you're not held back by the water. And you're making, you know, 2 to 4 times as much protein per acre as what the FAO would say was the #1 protein production crop in the world with this thing. And this is without really even optimizing it for this production. We're optimizing it to feed cows. And if you divide that, it takes about 30% more water to grow 4 times as much protein. Alfalfa per gallon of water is dramatically more efficient than most of the rest of these crops. But we don't eat alfalfa, right? We eat cows, we eat milk, but you know, are we going to switch our diet to eating cow food? Well, I do eat alfalfa. You eat alfalfa sprouts is probably something people have, but I like eating alfalfa right out of the field because I can tell the fertility of the soil by how the alfalfa tastes, which is a crazy thing in its own right. But the trick is we have to think outside the box. Most of when we think about sustainable food, we're thinking about the perimeter of the grocery store, the meats, the produce, those kinds of things that we eat directly from the field when we think about a crop. The middle of the store is all these things that are processed into boxes and jars. But that's still a lot of the food that we eat. Alfalfa, whether it's that 35% protein product that we're making now is just a powder, or we just do a simple extraction. We grew alfalfa to have the rumen of a cow extracted. How hard can that be? It's really easy to get this protein out of the plant. And we can make an 80% protein extract that's tasteless, but it's a high quality protein. It's got a good amino acid balance. And a lot of the things we're thinking about for the sustainability in a non-meat world, you can put this into an Impossible Burger and you'd never even know. If it's organic, it's even substantially cheaper than any other source you could do. So this is something where, again, we got to think about what's the market mechanism. Processed food is not going to go away. Let's stop making processed food based on the crappiest, tasteless ingredients we can put in and then flavoring it up. Let's make them more nutritious, and we can still flavor them up, but that's got its own issues. So how can we help? The thing I need, and the thing we talk about at this forum that Ori and I are on every week, is you got to tell me what you need in the crop. I mean, I can't guess. I don't know. You tell me what you need more of in a crop, it by itself or as a part of a cluster of ingredients. And then we can sort of ask questions. What does it do in the plant? What is it? Why is that in that plant in the first place? Because that'll give us a clue to what problem it's solving, what we can do to make that more. Is it something that varies by variety? You can almost always get that out of the literature. Is it something we can increase by fertility? For a lot of these things we don't know, but what's similar that we have done that gives us a clue to what tool worked to do that. And we can get those things as a starting point to just go out and put it on farms and put it on farms with different practices. And there are a small percentage of sort of the scientist farmer that we were talking about earlier that do real experiments with these kinds of things in different modes of fertility. And then we can sort of see what does it do. But ultimately, from the very beginning, I always want to know who's going to pay. Is the farmer going to make more money? Because you're never going to get adoption if it isn't something that makes the farm more money and at a price point that the consumer is willing to accept. What do we do then when we want to manipulate it? Well, the trick is that this soil is an ecosystem. And there's a whole thing we could do to talk about the ecosystem of the soil as a complex adaptive system. But it's something that we grow, we manipulate, we push in different directions for different purposes. We shift it into a stable bacterial-dominated state, into a stable fungal-dominated state. There's a variety of ways we can manipulate the system to get it to behave differently. You have to put back everything you took off and everything your ancestors took off. Right? It's not enough to say, okay, I took off 10 pounds of this, so I'm putting 10 pounds back. Somebody took off 500 pounds in the previous century. We got to get back to the levels of mineralization that allow a rich ecosystem to work. We got to minimize bad stuff that we do, poisons and tillage and things like that. And I like to just sort of, let's just try stuff too. Things that we know make biology work better. Molasses. Molasses is a waste product. It's cheap. It's cheapest sugar you can add. We add molasses on a crop and we can get a 10% yield bump for a lot of different crops just by adding some extra sugars at the right time around a crop when it's getting its start. There's a lot of stuff we don't understand about what's missing from a farm that we should be trying to figure this out. You have to be ready for it to be counterintuitive. Like I said before, sometimes nature's putting those things in for odd reasons. We have a whole thing we did with grapes where we wanted to make happy grapevines because that's our model, is how to make plants really happy. Oh, no, 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 no. To make great wine, plants have to suffer. They just shouldn't suffer with a fungal disease. They should suffer with a mineral requirement or something like that. You got to understand what it is that problem that's fundamentally being solved by the crop. And so when does a crop make something expensive because it's its only resort? Or when does it make something expensive because it has the freedom to just go ahead and do that? But the last thing that I think is critical is I do know something about complex biochemistry where people will pay. People will pay for flavor. And one of the interesting things about this group that Orient's on is we have a bunch of chefs. And they ask the question the same way I just did. What do you want me to get in the crop? They say, you just tell us what's supposed to be in the food and we'll make it taste good. We know how to make flavor taste good. So people want to pay money to buy it. So what's this link between nutritional quality and flavor? How do we make it taste good to get people to pay the farmer for it? And the nutrition is just a free ride. Everybody gets healthier. That would be great because we can solve those two problems. What Gary did on the farm is he was growing this more nutritionally rich milk. And he wasn't getting paid that much extra for all the incredible nutrition that went in. This organic farm was the Organic Farm of the Year in 2008. It's an iconic farm, unbelievable soils, and making this incredibly nutritious crops and milk, and he wasn't getting paid. So he made seasonal aged cheddars. It's an organic farm, so they eat outside a lot. The spring, nice fresh stuff just coming up. Summer, full flush of all that growth. The fall, it's starting to go down and dry out. And the winter, it's all stored, baled alfalfa. The same cows from the same fields, milk tastes completely different. Similar nutrient profile by the standard measures, completely different flavor in that thing. So he said, let's have seasonal aged cheddars. Here's the summer and the fall. He had them for all 4 seasons. Let's just make cheese out of it. You wouldn't believe that they were even from the same country. These are completely different flavors. People were, he eventually stopped doing the dairy, so he got rid of the line, but people were just going nuts over the fact that you have terroir of your farm expressed in the cheese, and they pay extra for it. And he was now direct to consumer at the same time. I don't have an hour to wax eloquent about tomatoes, but tomatoes is probably the purest expression. I don't really care how much lycopene is in. When you grow a tomato on these soils, the flavors are just unbelievable. This is half of a dinner, 2 weeks solid, where I just ate 2 full plates. This is a big size plates of these tomatoes and that organic basil that came off of a farm on the best soils that I've ever seen. And the flavor, I would just eat them for lunch whole, like you eat an apple, and then slice them up, and yeah, throw a little cheese in there and some olive oil and balsamic and salt and pepper, plate after plate, because it's just the most glorious flavor. And don't even get me started on strawberries. I mean, the flavors are intense. The other thing we used to do is, this is part of Gary's farm, my uncle's farm, and we farm Taliesin, Frank Lloyd Wright's family farm. So this is an achingly beautiful location. We recreated the layout of the crops that Frank Lloyd Wright, when he ran it, had laid out, so it's historically accurate. These soils are, they were crap soils when Gary took it over in 2000. They're the most unbelievable soils today. We bring people out and we run these farm dinners where everything they eat, we can point to the place where it came from. And there's animals that are grown on these crops. There are crops all around. There's a 70 different a vegetable farm that you're sitting in the middle of. Incredible flavors. And then the sun goes down and the fireflies come out, because we don't spray, because we're organic. And it's like something out of Lord of the Rings. The whole thing just glows with all these different colors and different densities of bugs and everything else. It's the most magical experience you can ever have. This locks flavor into your mind as a life experience, much like wine can often lead to life experiences. I think we got to figure out flavor at the same time as we do nutrition, because I think that's one of the ways that we can really lock people in to being able to want to do this. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much. Appreciate that, and happy to take questions.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Where's the football? Oh, there she's coming with it. Okay. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
So we'll start with a question in the hall, and if the Zoomers, for the Zoomers, this is a good time to switch the laundry from the washer to the dryer. So the Zoomers can just write in either in the Q&A or in the chat. I have a question, but we'll start here. And actually, I want to ask my first practical question. Where is that tomato farm?
Oh, well, this particular one is Del Cabo Farm and Jacobs Farms is the largest produce company, organic produce company in the United States, based on smallholder farmers in Latin America. So it's a great, elegant story about the people side of all of this. But they do most of the cherry tomatoes in the West. They do 80% of the organic basil.
Where are they located?
They're all over from Northern California all the way to Peru. But the trick is, there's this style of growing tomatoes on great soils, which is the old Italian farmer way. So he just took an average tomato variety, but he put it on a great soil, and you only water it twice. You water it once really deep at planting, and you got to have a good soil because it's got to hold a lot of that water. And then you plant it once more as the flowers are starting to come out and you're getting ready to make the crop. And then it puts on a lot of fruit. But because it's never watered again, it never makes big fruit, and it concentrates all that nutrition and flavor in these smaller sized tomatoes. He used to sell them through Trader Joe's. Everything you buy at Trader Joe's for organic cherry tomatoes, organic basil, is all Trader Joe's labeling of Del Cabo Farms. But he used to have these Italian dry farmed tomatoes, and then I could cheat, because I could go to the farm and actually, you know, get them. Oh my God, they're just so good. Yeah.
Yeah. Questions?
We had some questions here.
Oh yeah. Okay. let's start.
Could ocean water be used as water with mineral nutrients? So, sort of. So people do put a little bit of salt water on crops, and when micronutrients and stuff are missing, that can have a benefit. But we had kelp. So kelp is scavenging, especially some of the bigger kelps. They're easy to harvest. They dry out nicely. We were the biggest seller of Thorvin kelp, which was sort of one of these. It comes out of Iceland. It's dry geothermally. It's, you know, gently high nutrient kind of thing, and it just has scavenged the ocean for all the crazy little things that oceans have that plants need so little of that you could never justify adding them to the farm as a fertilizer. But they don't need, so this is an effective way to add something at, a few pounds per acre, or add it to a cow's diet to get all those seleniums and molybdenums and other kinds of things that are there. And so there's proxies for seawater that you can use for doing that. Natural alternatives to herbicides and fungicides. This is our life. We have never seen, so plants, weeds love our fertility. Okay, so we have to use other methods than fertility to manage the weeds, and that's mechanical kinds of things. But we're organic on these 10,000 acre farms, and so it's very doable kind of a thing. But we have never seen an economic loss due to an insect or an economic loss due to a fungus on a well mineralized soil and an organic farm. Now we have bugs like crazy, but we have good bugs and bad bugs. But why do trees have leaves? As you're walking around, you see a tree. The tree's always there. It's got those nice leaves. They're there all year long. Why doesn't somebody just eat them? There's all these bugs that are out there that are looking for something to eat. Why doesn't somebody just eat? Why do trees have any leaves at all? Because they're sitting ducks for any pest that wants to come along. Obviously, they know how to protect themselves from all those things. And if they're healthy, they make those natural protectants. If they're not healthy, they get eaten or they die. And so what we do with these incredibly healthy crops is we give the crops a chance. Micronutrients turn out to be so important in the natural antifungal properties of plants that we almost think of micronutrients as part of your fungicide budget. Stop using fungicides and put micronutrients on, because the lack of those is what's keeping the plant from helping it fight off fungal diseases. Pests, they're going to eat a little bit, but they don't eat very much. If you have a integrated pest management, you have some natural habitat around, that pest predators can be hanging out, waiting for the pest to show up, flying out there, eating all those things, and then going back to their refuge habitat. There's certain things like integrated pest management that work really nicely, but a lot of it is just make the plant so healthy that its natural mechanism for fighting off pests work. And so we do this routinely at, we did a third of the fertility on a third of all the organic farms. I mean, this is not something that is just iconoclastic to us. We just do it bigger in our own farming kind of thing.
So when you see, so when I go to purchase certain vegetables, how do I know their mineral content? Because this is never provided,
yep.
And they never test it, and it varies from farm to farm.
Yep.
So is there any resources that actually says this is what was measured last month in that farm?
No. So this is one of the issues. If nobody's making money selling those things and nobody's paying extra for those things, there's no reason for anybody to spend money measuring it. And so there's a famous study which was done probably 7 or 8 years ago now, where they looked at the nutritional content of organic and conventional crops. And there was no statistically significant difference between the two. And organic people had always talked about how more nutritious organic is. Well, that's not what they mean. They mean it's less deadly. It doesn't have the poisons in it, right? Which the poisons are there, and they're not measured as nutrients when you're comparing organic and conventional. But a really good biological conventional farm makes great, highly nutritious crops, even when it's using pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and genetically modified seeds. A really crappy organic farmer who's just organic by neglect and just hoping something grows that they can then make some extra money on because of the high price of the crop, that's incredibly unnutritious. And so it's not, organic tells you it's not poisonous, but it doesn't tell you that it's extra nutrition. Right now, there is no easy mechanism. And that's why, the carrots are an interesting thing. The more color you have for certain things, the more that's a signal of both the nutritional content, making those colors, and the ability of that plant to make complex biochemistries. But otherwise, until there's a reason for this in the marketplace, we're not going to measure it to be able to tell the consumer. Yeah.
That was very, very interesting, very enlightening. And maybe I misunderstood something, but you said that on a well-run organic farm, the yields are going to be higher than on a conventional farm, or maybe I misunderstood, but that kind of goes against.
Well, biological farm is what I meant. Okay, so what you said is true. So the reason I switched from trying to talk all these farmers into changing what they do is that we know how, the thing we're trying to tell them is how to make a whole lot more money, because there is nothing about organic farming that should cut the yield of the crop back. Done right, the yield on organic farm should be the same, or with a great soil, better than a conventional farm. Our average organic farm out yields the average conventional farm in the same county by 20 to 30%. And I get paid twice as much for the crop, and my costs are about the same, a little more on labor and a little bit less on chemicals, or zero on chemicals. And so I can make all 50% profit margin on a farm where the conventional person's breaking even. That's our secret. That's what we're out doing. That's why we're trying to really reinvent the supply chain for organic food. But the average canonical answer, because all the bad organic farmers that are doing sort of very little intensivity of the farming, they have low yields. There's nowhere else in farming is the range and yield by the farmer practice so huge as in organic. Yeah.
So you're saying that people will pay more, people will buy your products and they'll pay twice as much for it, but does that mean that all of the produce in the stores then is going to be more expensive?
Well, so I'm no fool. You're going to pay more than twice as much for the crop. I'm going to take. Okay, we'll take your money. Part of the reason we get away with it in this country is because food is only 6% of our budget, family budget, so it's a small percentage. People really care about not poisoning their kids, and so people will pay extra for it. So it's worth more. But the price difference right now, I think, is unacceptable. I grow organic corn and alfalfa and beans and all these other things at less than the cost that the conventional neighbor does. So as more and more people grow organic, the price will come down, and the price can go lower than the conventional price. Now, if the chemical companies will make less profit, the difference isn't as much. I mean, a big chunk of that's the profit the chemical companies make on all the inputs. But we can make organic farming per pound of crop cheaper for a lot of these different kinds of crops. But if you are in a store and you have a choice between organic and conventional, and the price is the same, you're only going to buy the organic, right? And so this price is a supply-demand kind of imbalance. At the private equity, we looked at buying what was supposed to be the only organic shrimp farm. And so we tried to look at, what's this organic shrimp versus all these other labels that were out there. And so we took the organic shrimp and we went to I forget what the name of the grocery store was, one of the big chains in the southeastern US where they eat a lot of shrimp. And we bagged up the same shrimp as organic, as hard claim good, no antibiotics, all the never kinds of claims, but not organic. And then the soft claims, all natural kind of thing. And then the regular conventional thing. And then we adjusted the price to see what the market price was. And there was almost no price difference between natural, the soft claim of good, and the regular old conventional stuff. Big step function, almost a twofold change in what people were willing to pay to buy hard claim stuff. And then another 20% or so for organic as sort of the premium end of the hard claim thing. So the consumer willingness to pay is there. But competition, because we have a large supply, should allow those costs to come down. That's one of my goals, is to be able to get this stuff back down to a price that is heavily affordable to almost everybody, but has all the benefits of it being nutritious and hopefully someday, being organic and not deadly, and hopefully someday being more nutritious. Oh, one last question. Recycling cow waste for energy production and using the byproduct to increase farm quality. You can do that. And frankly, I built a whole product line around the digester waste from a big dairy farm as a way to do this. And so there are reasons to do it. I think the trick is that the soil needs to be fed as though it was a separate organism. And so when you run a digester to make energy out of manures, you're burning up the energy content of that. You're putting the nutrients back in, but where's the energy content coming? Now, if you put cover crops in, you can change the rotation to supplement that energy. But the reality is, you want to feed the microbes, and it's just not the minerals. They also need to be fed organic matter. A third of all the photosynthate that any plant makes, it pumps out its roots. It's constantly pumping sugar out the roots to feed the microbes and the microbiome around the roots. And that's because those bacteria that you want to grow and the things that eat bacteria that you want to feed on the bacteria to cycle nutrients, that is a system that needs to be fed. And it's just like in sewage treatment. There's products now that you can get that pull the phosphate out of the sewage treatment plant and use that as a phosphate fertilizer. Well, fine, but what do you do now with the rest of all that organic matter, which doesn't have any phosphate? If I'm going to use it as a fertilizer, I got to add the phosphate back to put it on the field in sort of a balanced stoichiometry of what the crop is. And so, they're tricky things in terms of how do you do that waste management. Here's a whole bunch more.
Yeah, Richard Bergman is asking, what if people stop drinking milk?
Well, I would miss cheese. I have to say, people are drinking a lot less milk. It's a crisis in the dairy industry because people are drinking less milk. They're in part they're doing it because they're eating plant-based milks, oat milk and soy milk and these other kinds of things. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think changing people's, if we were all God, we could change people's diets and we could have healthier people and a better planet. We're not, and so, or if anybody is, keep it quiet for a while. But the trick is, how do we balance these things against what we value in terms of people's ability to make choices for themselves? But I do think the market and people's perceptions of the value to the planet of making different choices in their food is starting to penetrate.
Great.
Okay.
I have one more question.
Yep.
When you spoke about the protein coming from the corn,
Mm-hmm.
and you said this is not a very valuable or nutritious protein. Probably the composition of amino acid there is not as great.
Right.
And do you have some kind of an objective measure or scale to actually?
Well, it's a PDCA kind of.
We can actually say this has better protein than that protein per gram protein. Right.
Yep. So the PDCA, there's these proton dietary, whatever that PDCAAS thing stands for, and basically it's a function. It's a mapping of the amino acid composition of a protein on that from a plant on the amino acid composition that's required by the thing that eats the plant. Okay, us in that case. And so functionally, a lot of this is about sulfur amino acids. So that's why on one of the graphs I had methionine down there. And the reason we care about methionine is it's the only amino acid that you can't get in an organic form for organic farming. And so we have limited amounts of synthetic methionine that we can add to feed an animal, and it limits how much growth you get in the animal. So if I can bump the methionine in a crop specifically, it also bumps all the other sulfur amino acids. And we've been able to do that quite dramatically by changing the sulfur metabolism of the soil. And then all of a sudden sulfur amino acids are easier to do. But it's that amino acid matching kind of a thing. And corn, grown in a no sulfur metabolism soil, just has a very bad match. And then it's just, you add that protein, but it's not really helping the cow make the proteins that it needs to for its body and for the milk. And so you add supplements, you add synthetic methionine and other kinds of things. And all the other sulfur amino acids are usually in that mix. And then depending on there's a lot of weird soil things that show up as very specific amino acid excesses and deficiencies that are geographically limited. And, that kind of stuff is where there's a specific formula for, Texas that's different from a formula for Pennsylvania and vice versa. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Really enjoyed this. Thank you.